Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Inclusive Narratives of Management History. And I'm Dr. Leon Prieto, Division Chair of the Management History Division of the Academy of Management. And today we have a very exciting session entitled Embracing Cultural Tradition, Historic Business Activity by Native People in the Western United States. So the esteemed speaker is Dr. Joseph Gladstone, who is an associate professor of management at Washington State University. And Dr. Gladstone's scholarship explores culturally relevant management education, notably the intersection of Western influence management science and Native American and indigenous peoples' cultures. So his internationally recognized work, it explores indigenous philosophy, transplanar wisdom, and his work has been published in leading journals such as the Academy of Management, Learning and Education, Leadership, the Journal of Management Education, American Indian Quarterly, and he also co-edited a book called American Indian Business, Principles and Practice, published by University of Washington Press. And Dr. Gladstone also founded the Native and Indigenous Peoples Caucus in the Academy of Management. And he is a past president of the PhD Project Management Doctoral Student Association, and he serves as one of the faculty advisors. So he has a very extensive resume, as you can tell. So we ask that you go on mute and save your questions to the very end, because we have 15 minutes of question and answers allotted for that. So take it away, Dr. Gladstone.
Okay, well, good afternoon again to those on the East Coast, and good morning for those on this side of the time zones. And thank you for that warm introduction. So the work I'm talking about today is a past work I was doing that I'm actually picking up again now that I have the opportunity. And the questions that I have with this work is basically ties with my idea of culture and business, and where does the concept of business fit within indigenous cultures. And there's some challenges going on when it comes to management education for indigenous people. And so I'm bringing up this work today to kind of show the foundation of the work where I'm going in my career here. So there's some questions that have been asked in the past, and basically, Native people have conducted trade for a very long time, for basically as long as there are any kind of records that exist. And so we know that there has been trade amongst the different tribes in the Americas. The question that comes up, though, is basically who's in charge of regulating the trade? Who's in charge of doing the negotiations for the communities? And is it the role of the tribal governments, or are people individually allowed to do this? And today the conflict arises is that there are people today who think that it's our Native people basically today who think that that commerce should be conducted exclusively by tribal governments, and this kind of creates a little bit of a friction for practicing enterprisers today. In the slides, you'll see that I'm going to use the word entrepreneurs. This is, right now, I'm just using that term primarily in the Western sense of what an entrepreneur is. That is somebody who takes on risk to create their own business and operate the business, all the traditional definitions for entrepreneur. One thing that has come to light, though, in my work is that entrepreneur doesn't appear to be a proper word to use in Indian country, and the proper word would be enterpriser. I'll bring that up later at the end of my presentation, but for now in the presentation, I'm going to be using the word entrepreneur since these are where the earlier questions were based. And so, again, who has control of doing this? And then the current thinking right now, I don't quite agree with. And so the first thought is that a lot of tribal economies are thought to be collective, that tribal people are collective communities, and everything we do in terms of wealth acquisition is done on behalf of everybody. Nobody should be acquiring their own pile of wealth for their own use. Everything that is collected within the economy should be distributed equally among its members. So that kind of leads to another question then on business. So if you're not allowed to acquire your own wealth, then if you have a business, then any businesses within tribal community should be owned by the collective rather than by individual people. And today, that's seen as where there's an assumption out there right now that tribal people on the reservations believe that any economic activity practiced on the reservations is the sole domain of tribal governments. This kind of creates an area of friction, though, is that among practicing business people who own their own businesses and operate as entrepreneurs and enterprisers, that what they are doing could conflict with these tribal cultural values in terms of owning their own business, acquiring their own wealth. And is that a proper thing to do? Is what we are doing right? To do so goes against the cultural values, and you could be harming the culture. And so another assumption is then that there are tribal communities who discourage private entrepreneurial activity because the tribal communities believe that economic activity is the domain of governments. People should not be practicing on their own, because it's the government's responsibility to operate their economies, to own their businesses, to hire the people, and then any of the wealth that comes out of those businesses is distributed through the tribe, generally in the form of providing social services, but also in the form of providing per capita payments, which are basically distributions to tribal members, and their eligibility is based off of their membership in the tribe. To own a business again as a private individual doesn't allow that. Therefore, you're stepping out of the traditional tribal collectivist norms. But when you think about it, when you look at the history, you find out that private business has always existed in tribal communities within some form or another. When you look at the archaeological evidence that's out there, and you look at reports by traders, you'll find out that these private activities either historically, archaeologically, very likely existed, but did exist when you look at what the traders had reported. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is I'm going to talk about a couple of regions in the West, and that's primarily my research in this area focuses on. So we're looking at the United States Southwest and the Four Corners regions, and we're looking at the Pacific Northwest. So anything that I talk about here is primarily focusing on those areas and any assumptions or implications that could come up related to anything further east beyond the Rocky Mountains might not be applicable in those areas. And so the Four Corners areas, for those not familiar with the Four Corners, it's the one spot in the United States where four states meet at once, and those are from the northwest and going down to the southeast. That would be Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, and all of them meet in an area known as the Four Corners. Looks pretty much like this site here. One thing that makes the Four Corners very unique is that all of the land in the Four Corners is actually on Indian reservations. 3/4 of that land is the Navajo reservation, and the portion in Colorado is the Ute reservation. And so this is a region that's still very deeply rich with its different tribal heritage and cultures. So the Four Corners area had been occupied long before the Spanish, who were the first Europeans to get in that area. And Pueblo tribes, and I apologize for using the term Pueblo tribes, they're more local, regional terms, but unfortunately my first language is English, and so for this presentation, I'm going to be sticking with the Spanish term of the Pueblos. The Pueblos had participated in economies among themselves for a very long time. And these economies extended, were concentrated within the Four Corners, at least for this study, but they extended from, the Central America. There's some assumptions that items had come up from South America, and then there are items that actually come up from the north. And there's a region called Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. And so when you look at the Four Corners region, this was a very large hub for trade within the Americas. There's one thing to think about, though, that when you're thinking about trade, it's not only trade occurred there, but there was also production. An example of one of these areas is called Mesa Verde, and Mesa Verde is in Colorado. Oh, let me go back really quick. I wanted to show you. This is that first picture there. You'll see some ruins down there. That's actually part of Chaco Canyon, which is in Arizona. And Chaco Canyon, of these old communities, was the largest. It's basically a very large metropolitan city, if you wanted to put it in that sense. And it's something I'd like to call the Mall of the Americas. It was where a lot of the trade came in, production, distribution of goods, and everything else. But there's not much left there. So we're going to look at Mesa Verde. Mesa Verde is in Colorado, and it's one of many different cliff structures that you find in the southwest area. Mesa Verde is one of the largest, though, so that's why it's a very interesting place to look at. And so what you're looking at here in this picture, which is actually a National Park Service picture, is just one of many little, I guess you can call them villages, these communities that are built within these cliffs. And there's different sites scattered throughout not only Mesa Verde region, but throughout the Pacific, not just the desert Southwest. You have smaller villages in areas as far away as Flagstaff, Arizona. You get them up north going into Utah and into up into Colorado. So there's these villages scattered throughout a very large region of the Four Corners. And so all these villages had their own forms of production and trade. The Mesa Verde region, of all of those regions, is actually pretty young. It was, estimated to be around the 12th century, and it was only about 100 years old or before it ceased to exist. The reason why these villages collapsed and all these systems collapsed is still questionable. But that's, for the most part, we're looking at in this story that I'm sharing today is basically the trade and the commerce that occurred in that area. So why Mesa Verde is where it's at is because it's basically a safe place to produce goods. You're safe from marauders. You're up on a very high cliff. People can't come in and basically raid your village and take your goods. There's probably within some of these villages about 100 people. And they existed primarily like very large apartment complexes. And so there's residential areas, and there's sites in there as you looked in the, I don't know if my mouse is going to show up, but you see a lot of these smaller structures on the side of it. So a lot of these were communal housing, places of worship, but a lot of these areas are also production, where they made a lot of small goods. According to the archaeological information that's available at these sites, there are pottery goods, there are textile goods, food goods. And the thing is that these goods that were produced were then transported up and over these mountains. And as you can see here in this picture, you can see just kind of an arc, and you can just barely see within inside of the that kind of arc there, the structures of Pueblo Bonito in that one area. But you see that it's a very large plains area. And so they had to produce these goods and get them up either over the cliffs or down through a lot of the canyons that existed in that area. But they all interconnected with each other, and then all these trade kind of moved towards Chaco Canyon and then to other regions throughout the area. And so the point being is that there is a whole bunch of these villages that existed in the desert Southwest, and they produced goods and they distributed the goods. The thing is that these areas are so big that you raises questions. Basically, who controls all of this trade? Is there, when you think about the communities are rather small but very scattered, is there a form of a central government that can control this production of goods and then manage how the trade would occur? Okay. So when you think about the history, then it's a lot of these activities occurred basically on family levels, and that they produced their own goods. They then, the raw materials came in, they're transformed into some sort of goods and distributed out. And so looking at this history, this archaeological history, and again, there's nothing recorded, nothing written. So we can only look at the evidence of the structures and the way they're designed and how they're laid out. That it's plausible that there could never have been really a command type of economy, a central kind of control, that everyone pretty much had to operate on their own family levels. When you think about the concept of what a tribe is, a tribe is a very large society of many families and other societies together. But when you look at a lot of the structures in the Mesa Verde region and throughout the Four Corners regions, you didn't have these large, you didn't have any large concentrated government area that can control this. Okay. And so we can now go from some basically ruins and then trade routes that occurred in these ruins and start looking at something a little bit more recent. And so we're going to look at the Pacific Northwest. And we're looking at here is Celilo Falls. And Celilo Falls sits on the Columbia River. And the Columbia River is a very large, very large river that, drains all the way from British Columbia, Canada, goes to Washington State. And the Celilo Falls sits on the Washington State, Oregon State line. And there was a huge salmon runs came through here. And what you're seeing now is Celilo Falls. It doesn't exist anymore. Celilo Falls was inundated by the Dalles Dam. And so that occurred in the 50s. But up until that time, Celilo was a very large trading region. It was, it was seen as one of the major trading centers for the Pacific Northwest. And the reason why is it connected the coastal tribes, which had a lot of fish-based economy and other, economy based off of, local goods. And people went upstream. The Columbia River went as far as British Columbia, but a tributary of that river is the Snake River. And that flows all the way up through Idaho and has headwaters up at Yellowstone Park. And so it fed not only the coastal tribes, but it went as far inland to serve the Plains tribes. So that area is basically, it serves areas, what is now Alaska and present day California. So it was a very large trading hub here at these falls. So the Celilo Falls community, though, was estimated to be over 1,000 years old before it collapsed because of the dam. It was not just a fishing village, but it was a trading hub like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde in the United States. The Pacific Coast people, they like to get the stuff that came from the plains. Basically, if you've ever been in the Pacific Northwest, it's a lot like the Northeast, actually. It's damp and it's cold. And so you would get the heavier robes, buffalo robes that came in from the plains. But also it turns out that the people in the plains enjoyed the fish and other goods that came out of the Pacific Coast. And a lot of the coastal shells and other things that were used for utilities and artwork that went into the plains. So the Dalles then was seen as a confluence of cultures, with a lot of trading goods occurring. Because of this, there was a lot of languages and technologies and other things that occurred within these areas. So when you're looking at a historian, Barber, he did a very good description of the Dalles. And because the Dalles had existed up until the dam had, or not the dam, Celilo Falls had existed up until the Dalles Dam. and that activity all that time, we have a little bit better record and a little bit more oral tradition behind these areas than we have in the desert Southwest. I like this one quote that came from Barber, is that the great emporium or mart of the Columbia rivers. All right. Let's see. Here we go. And so when you look at these areas of the United States in the Southwest and in the Pacific Northwest, you start getting very long established communities that have always had trade, and the trade has been very broad. And then there was also production of goods in those areas as well. So the Dalles, people not only had the fish, they processed the fish. The raw material that came in these communities in the Dalles, goods are processed out there. So we're still asking, who controls all of this? And that's the main question. Even though that we have this history of a long trade, who controls this trade? Who controls negotiation of goods and the exchange of these goods? Well, when you look at the historical records from the fur traders, basically Hudson's Bay Company and de la Vérendrye, who is a French trapper who came in from Montreal and went into the Wyoming areas, they actually had written records and how they communicated with these tribal groups. And so I'm going to look primarily at the Hudson's Bay Company in this presentation. It's an old company, and the neat thing about Hudson's Bay is, since they're British, they kept meticulous records of everything that occurred there. And so they had a region that went from Hudson's Bay, Canada, way up north, and they actually went into the Pacific Northwest. And so down in this area where I'm at now in the greater Seattle area. And so these people exchanged goods, European goods, with the tribes. And there's a lot that's written here within these slides, but to summarize these slides, what I want to say is that from the journals of the Hudson's Bay Company and also from de la Vérendrye, there are two key stories. De la Vérendrye and his exploits when he was going through primarily the Wisconsin-Minnesota area, he encountered different tribal communities. And a lot of times he would meet a headman or a chief of a community, and that person would claim, basically, eminent domain over the community, that if you want to do any trade with us, you have to go through me. But and this also happened with the Hudson's Bay, when they would be talking with tribal communities. They would meet some people who would say that you have to go through me. But both of them, in their experiences, had both encountered individuals who said, no, you don't really have to talk with these folks. You can, just negotiate directly with us. We'll probably give you a better deal. And so that kind of gives you a historical example of where, you could have a tribal community, controlling what is exchanged out there and how the trade process occurs and who you negotiate with. But you still had, through these journals, that there are individual families who wanted to work outside of the auspices of that tribal government, if you want to put it in that sense, to do trade. And so when you look at these histories, you're going back as far as, from Isham, in the 1700s, and de la Vérendrye, is also in the 1700s, that there has always been kind of this two types of systems where there would be tribal people who would want to have control over the entire domain, but you still had individual people who too wanted to do their own thing. Does that answer the question? Is it proper? Is it right? That's actually still kind of an unknown, but it's not something this idea of being an enterpriser today is not a new concept. It's not something that was introduced recently. That we have always historically been producing goods as individual families, either what you can apply from the archaeological record, or that you can gain from the historical records from the fur traders. And so when you look at something that's been going on for a very long time and it's kind of embedded in a culture, it's you still get you raise very good. Well, at least I can raise some very good points that it's something that we've always been doing. It's never really ever been discouraged to practice individually. There are ideas where, there have been some archaeological records, such as Franz Boas in the Pacific Northwest Potlatch, where he describes the Potlatch communities up here, actually just, up the street from me up in the further towards Bellingham and in the British Columbia regions, where the Kwakiutl tribes, their leaders would gather the wealth, but then they would have to give away all their wealth to the community. But that's only a Pacific Northwest thing. That wasn't something that was seen in other tribes or other communities, this idea of that. And so, there's a lot of questions then that, exist that say, is it still proper? When you extend it historically, it probably is. It's okay to be an enterprise or operate on your own and, still go for, produce your own goods. But the work that it did afterwards, based off of this history, when I interviewed contemporary modern enterprisers, is that they sense that it's okay to do that. That people recognize that they have their own businesses, but they also distribute some of their wealth in the forms of their communities, either be it donations back to their communities. The biggest thing is the idea of competition. And I guess that's where one of the challenges come in that needs to be explored further. And this is work that will be engaging in soon, is looking, based off of this record and what I've already looked at prior, is basically tightening this idea of where does the enterpriser's role fit within the tribe, and then it's basically its proper fit. When you look at the tribes, where is their fit within their economies? And so I'm going to continue on here. And so what I have is a theory today where some people question, is it proper to be an individual and have your own business? And is it the exclusive role of the government to operate businesses? And so my theory is basically all of this thinking comes from the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. Prior to 1934, tribes were pretty much dependent on the United States government for all of their daily lives, economic lives, health lives, everything. And they were seen as domestic dependent states. In 1934, the United States government created the Indian Reorganization Act, which kind of gave some sovereignty back to the tribes by giving the tribes giving them permission to create their own governments and operate, their own governments and operate their own economies. But within that IRA structure, it placed the economic decisions, economic activities as a domain of the tribal governments. And so it never really specifically said anything about independent people, is that the IRA, United States law, says that the tribal governments, the tribal councils, are responsible for their economic activity. And so when you look at the history of this from 1934, we're talking an act now that's been 90 years old. And people, nowadays, who here is 90 years old and can remember, can remember their childhood and a time before that. And so when you exist in a certain system all your life, you see that as the norm. And so I think a lot of what happens today is that people have this perception that it's the tribal government's responsibility to, sole responsibility for economic activity, not because of its tradition, but because the Indian Reorganization Act prescribed it. And it's something they only see, and it's the only thing they know. And so my purpose of my historical work then is to reach deeper and to show that there's always been these two systems, that there's always been, small groups that had their own activities, then, independent of the others, but no one's ever really been punished from it. And you look at all the reports of anything, you never see anyone that's ever been discouraged from doing business on their own. It's basically, kind of a form of competition. Some people like to, like to have control of their societies and their groups, and others don't like to have that control. It's something that people are like today. Okay, and so, that's kind of a historical, view of what the economies look like. When you look at, you can look at the archaeological record, you can look at the historical record, and then, kind of develop more questions. And so the work that I'm doing right now is just basically foundational questions. Where I'm going now with this is actually exploring an assumption that hasn't really been explored deeply. And a lot of the reports about tribal communities discouraging their communities or discouraging their individual tribal members who are having their own businesses is only described, almost anecdotally. There's really no empirical work right now that no one's actually ever asked community members themselves, who has the responsibility for, owning businesses and operating these businesses. And so a project that I'm starting to work on now is actually just going in and interviewing the tribal community members. I'll be starting here in the Pacific Northwest, but as time goes on, hopefully, I look forward to, interviewing other tribal communities. It's important, though, that you have to look at tribal communities as those on reservation, those off reservation, so the urban Indians, because of their experiences being in the cities, they would have different perceptions of economies than those on reservations, where a lot of tribal governments do own the businesses and operate and distribute those goods. All right, and so that's my presentation here. Let me stop my share here. And I guess we can get into the questions. I saw some chat come up here.
Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank you, for this enlightening presentation,
Thank you.
So this was very informative. And let me thank the audience for sticking around to ask some questions.